Dis vult, God wills it. The words echoed like thunder through the cold night air of Clermont, France in 1095. A crowd of thousands erupted in cheers, as if the heavens themselves had spoken. Men raised their hands to the sky, tears streaming down faces hardened by war and poverty. In that moment, something irreversible was set in motion, a movement that would reshape continents, religions, and destinies. This was not merely a war. It was a call to eternity. The world of the 11th century was a fractured place. In the West, Europe had just begun to recover from centuries of chaos after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Kingdoms were rising, but they were still fragile, fragmented by local lords, languages, and loyalties. Meanwhile, to the east, the Byzantine Empire stood as a fading guardian of ancient glory, powerful yet threatened on all sides. And at the heart of it all lay Jerusalem, a city that was more than just a place on a map. To Christians, it was the Holy Sepulchre, the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. To Muslims, it was Al-Quds, the third holiest site in Islam. To Jews, it was the city of David, the eternal homeland. For centuries, these communities had coexisted under shifting rulers. But in the late 11th century, winds of change began to stir. The Seljuk Turks, fierce warriors of the steppe who had embraced Islam, swept westward. They seized much of Anatolia, defeating the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, a shattering loss that sent shockwaves through the Christian world. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, facing collapse, turned to the one power he once saw as a rival, the Pope. Pope Urban II saw an opportunity, both spiritual and political. In 1095 at the Council of Clermont, he delivered a fiery speech that would change history. He spoke of atrocities in the Holy Land, some exaggerated, others invented, to ignite the passions of the crowd. He offered forgiveness of sins to anyone who would take up the cross and fight. And when the crowd cried, "Deus vult, God wills it," the first crusade was born. What followed was something unprecedented. Across Europe, nobles, knights, peasants, even criminals sewed crosses onto their clothes and began marching east. It wasn't just kings and armies. Entire societies were mobilizing. Some were driven by faith, others by greed, adventure, or desperation. For many, this was the only chance to escape the brutal feudal life and earn eternal salvation. The journey was brutal. Tens of thousands set off on what they believed was a divine mission. But logistics were disastrous. There were no clear plans, no central leadership. Along the way, so-called People's Crusades descended into chaos. Mobs attacked Jewish communities across Europe. One of the darkest early episodes of this movement. Many died before even reaching Asia Minor. But the main Crusader armies, led by powerful nobles like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond IV of Toulouse, and Bohemond of Taranto, eventually reached Byzantine lands. Emperor Alexios demanded they swear oaths of loyalty to him, hoping to regain lost territory. Uneasy alliances were formed between these proud Western lords and the sophisticated, suspicious Byzantines. When the Crusaders crossed into Anatolia, they faced a new kind of warfare. The Seljuk Turks used hit-and-run tactics, horse archers, and psychological warfare. But despite starvation, disease, and internal rivalries, the Crusaders achieved what many thought impossible. They captured Nicaea, defeated Turkish forces at Daralium, and pressed on toward Syria. Their ultimate goal loomed ahead: Jerusalem. But between them and the Holy City stood the formidable walls of Antioch, a key stronghold on the Orontes River. What happened there would become legend. The road to Antioch was long and merciless. By the time the Crusader armies reached the city in October 1097, their numbers had already been thinned by hunger, disease, and constant ambushes. But Antioch was not just another city. It was the gateway to Jerusalem. Whoever controlled Antioch controlled the road south. The city itself was colossal, surrounded by massive stone walls and towers that had stood for centuries. It was considered nearly impregnable. But the Crusaders, driven by faith and desperation, laid siege to the city for 8 relentless months. Supplies ran out. Horses were slaughtered for food. Soldiers boiled leather and weeds to survive. Desertion was common, but for many, turning back meant eternal shame. Inside the city, the Muslim defenders held strong. Outside, a relief army from Mosul advanced, threatening to crush the Crusaders between the city walls and their reinforcements. The Crusaders were trapped in a tightening vise. And then, in the dead of night, betrayal changed everything. A local tower commander, secretly sympathetic to the Crusaders or perhaps motivated by gold, opened a gate. In June 1098, Crusader forces poured in, overwhelming the defenders and seizing Antioch. But their victory was short-lived. The relief army arrived almost immediately, laying siege to the Crusaders inside the very city they had just captured. Starving, surrounded, and exhausted, morale plummeted. It seemed the crusade might end here, not in Jerusalem but in ruin. Then, a strange event occurred. A peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have received a divine vision revealing the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side. He led soldiers to a church dug into the floor and found a spearhead. Whether it was genuine or staged didn't matter. The Crusaders believed it. Inspired by the supposed miracle, they surged out of the gates and defeated the vastly larger Muslim force. Antioch was theirs. After nearly 2 years of unimaginable suffering, the road to Jerusalem lay open. But Jerusalem itself was not an easy target. By the time the Crusaders reached its walls in June 1099, their army had been reduced to a fraction of its original size. Still, what remained was hardened by fire. Jerusalem's defenders were prepared. The city was fortified and supplied. The Crusaders lacked siege engines, ladders, even basic food and water. Under the blistering Levantine sun, desperation mounted. Then, using wood from dismantled ships brought by Genoese sailors, they constructed siege towers. On July 15, 1099, after days of fighting, a Crusader tower reached the walls. Soldiers stormed through. What followed was one of the bloodiest episodes of the Middle Ages. The Crusaders slaughtered thousands of Muslims and Jews, filling the streets with blood, as chroniclers vividly described. To the victors, it was divine justice. To the defeated, it was an apocalypse. Jerusalem was taken, and the First Crusade had achieved its improbable goal. In the aftermath, the Crusaders established 4 Crusader states: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. For the first time in centuries, Western Europeans ruled parts of the Holy Land. But this was not the end. It was only the beginning of nearly 2 centuries of brutal conflict. Back in Europe, news of victory spread like wildfire. Songs were sung, churches were filled, and more people prepared to take the cross. In the Islamic world, the shock of Jerusalem's fall would eventually give rise to powerful new leaders, men who would change the course of the Crusades forever. And among them would emerge a name that would echo through history: Salah ad-Din Saladin. The fall of Jerusalem in 1099 sent shockwaves through the Islamic world. At first, there was no united response. Muslim rulers were fragmented, divided into rival dynasties and regions. For decades, the Crusader states survived not because they were invincible, but because their enemies were disunited. But slowly the tide began to turn. In the mid-12th century, a new figure emerged. A man who would reshape the Muslim response, Wu-Alelgo ad-Din Yt Suf ibn Ibi, known in the West as Saladin. Born in Tikrit, raised in the courts of powerful leaders, Saladin rose through military ranks with intelligence, discipline, and vision. He was unlike the rulers before him. While others focused on personal power, Saladin focused on unity. By the 1170s, Saladin had consolidated Egypt and Syria under his rule. He reformed armies, strengthened defenses, and rallied his people under the banner of jihad, not in the sense of chaotic violence, but as a unifying holy mission to reclaim Jerusalem. He was admired not only by his followers but even by many of his enemies, who saw in him a leader of honor, strategy, and charisma. The Crusaders, meanwhile, had grown complacent. Generations had passed since the First Crusade. The original zeal had faded. Internal rivalries among Crusader lords weakened their defenses, and European powers grew distracted by their own ambitions. The perfect storm was forming. In 1187 it struck. Saladin's forces confronted the Crusaders near the Horns of Hattin, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. The Crusaders, poorly positioned and desperate for water under the scorching sun, were encircled. Saladin's army set grass fires to choke them with smoke. By the end of the day, the Crusader army was annihilated. The true cross, their most sacred relic, was captured, and within months Jerusalem fell back into Muslim hands. But unlike 1099, there was no massacre. Saladin spared many of the city's inhabitants, allowing ransoms for safe passage. His actions would make him a legendary figure, not just in the Islamic world, but also in European chronicles. The fall of Jerusalem triggered the Third Crusade. Europe erupted in calls for vengeance. Three of Europe's most powerful rulers answered: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Sepu of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a clash of titans. Richard vs. Saladin, two of the greatest military figures of the age. The campaigns were fierce. Battles raged along the coast of the Levant. Richard's tactical brilliance matched Saladin's strategic patience. Yet despite Richard's victories, including the legendary Battle of Arsuf, he could not retake Jerusalem. In the end, Richard and Saladin signed a truce, allowing Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem but leaving the city under Muslim control. Richard returned to Europe a hero, but the Crusaders' dream of a permanent Christian Jerusalem had slipped away. Over the next century, more crusades would follow, the fourth, fifth, even children's crusades. But none would replicate the shocking triumph of the first or the legendary duels of the third. Crusader states weakened, and in 1291, with the fall of Acre, the last Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land collapsed. The crusading era was over, yet its impact was eternal. The Crusades reshaped trade routes, brought East and West into violent contact, spread ideas and technologies, and altered religious and political landscapes for centuries. They left behind a legacy of both cultural exchange and deep wounds, narratives of heroism and horror, faith and fanaticism. And even today, the Crusades remain one of the most complex, controversial, and captivating chapters in human history, a story where faith and power collided, and the world changed forever. History is not just about kings and battles. It's about choices, moments when humanity stood at crossroads and took paths that shaped the future. The Crusades were one of those moments. If you found this journey through time enlightening, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because more forgotten chapters of history are waiting to be uncovered. This was the Crusades, holy wars that shaped the world.